Warning: this story contains disturbing details about a cold case. For 22 years, the disappearance of high school senior Sarah Jenkins in the quiet town of Oak Haven, Oregon, has been a ghost story whispered on the breeze, a faded yearbook photo tucked away in dusty attics. Everyone assumed it was a tragic accident, perhaps a runaway teen lost in the vast, unforgiving woods surrounding the valley. Swallowed by the earth without a trace, she just vanished. The townspeople would say, shaking their heads, the mystery calcifying into local legend. That was the narrative, the comfortable, if heartbreaking truth they clung to, until a hiker, miles off the beaten path, stumbled upon something rusted and buried deep beneath overgrown vines. A simple locket Sarah was known to wear, next to disturbing markings carved into the ancient oak. "This changes everything," a detective murmured later, the words hanging heavy in the sterile air of the precinct. The small locket wasn't just proof she'd been there. It was a horrifying promise, a silent scream from the past, revealing evidence that proved this wasn't an accident at all. It was something far more deliberate, far more chilling. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe if you believe secrets never stay buried. In the late summer of 1988, Oak Haven felt suspended in time, a sun-drenched pocket of peace where days drifted by like dandelion seeds on a warm current. 17-year-old Sarah lived within its gentle rhythm, her life a tapestry woven with quiet routines and vibrant dreams that pulsed just beneath the surface of her calm exterior. She spent her afternoons at the local library, the scent of old paper a comforting constant, tracing possibilities on maps of distant cities she longed to see, her fingers brushing against foreign names like whispered spells. Her psychology was one of hopeful determination, a resilience born from small-town limitations and fueled by a fierce yearning for something more, something bigger than the familiar horizon of evergreen trees. She loved her younger brother fiercely, their shared secrets a lifeline, and felt a complicated ache in her chest around her mother, a silent understanding passing between them in shared glances across the dinner table. Sarah harbored a vulnerability she rarely showed, a fear of staying trapped, a quiet anxiety about the unknown waiting just beyond graduation, mixed with the heady anticipation of escape. She spent the morning of September 18th feeling an unusual restlessness, the air thick and still, a strange energy buzzing low like distant thunder, though the sky remained achingly clear. She had plans for that evening, simple plans that felt momentous, a shift in the quiet predictability of her world. As she walked out the front door, the screen door slapping shut behind her, leaving the familiar scent of cinnamon and home behind, she pulled her worn denim jacket tighter, unaware that the ordinary walk into the late afternoon sun was about to become anything but ordinary. The late morning sunlight, buttery and warm, slanted through the dusty pane of Sarah's bedroom window, illuminating a room held in perfect, unnerving stillness. Her mother, Helen, had called her name 3 times from the bottom of the stairs, her voice carrying the easy, everyday cadence of a Saturday. No answer. A sigh, tinged with mild exasperation at teenage slumber, lifted Helen up the steps. She reached the closed door, its familiar white paint slightly chipped near the handle, and knocked gently. "Sarah? Honey, time to get up." Silence. She knocked again, a little firmer this time. Still nothing. A frown creased her brow. This wasn't like Sarah, not after being called twice. Helen tried the doorknob. It didn't budge. Locked. A prickle of unease, small and sharp, began at the back of Helen's neck. Why would Sarah lock her door? She rarely did. She called her name again, louder, pressing her ear against the wood, listening for any stir. Only the faint hum of the house answered her. Her husband, Thomas, hearing the repeated calls in the silence, came up the stairs, his expression shifting from sleepy curiosity to concern as he saw Helen's worried face. "What's wrong? She sleeping late?" he asked, trying the handle himself with more force. It remained steadfastly locked from the inside. "It's locked," Helen whispered, the simple word heavy with sudden, inexplicable dread. Thomas nudged her gently aside and rapped sharply. "Sarah, open the door. This isn't funny." The silence from within felt like a physical wall. Panic, cold and rapid, began to bloom in Helen's chest. Where could she be? She looked past Thomas to the landing window, then back at the bedroom door, her mind racing through impossible scenarios. Thomas fetched a screwdriver, his movements growing frantic, working at the simple lock. The sound of scraping metal against wood was harsh, alien in the quiet house. Finally, the mechanism gave way with a small, sad snap. Thomas pushed the door open. The room was meticulously tidy, almost undisturbed. The bedspread was smooth, unrumpled. Her favorite book lay face down on the nightstand, a bookmark holding its place. A half-finished sketchpad sat on her desk next to a cup of long, cold tea. It was as if she had simply stepped out for a moment. Thomas strode quickly to the window, checking the latch. Locked, tight. He went to the other window, also locked from the inside. The air in the room suddenly felt suffocatingly thick. Helen stumbled inside, her eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. "Sarah?" she choked out, her voice trembling. There was nowhere to hide. The closet was empty of her presence, clothes hanging neatly. Under the bed, nothing. The room was empty. The impossible truth landed like a physical blow. Sarah was gone, vanished from a room, locked from the inside, with no other exit. Thomas ran back to the landing window, scanning the grounds outside, a desperate, wild look in his eyes. Helen sank onto the edge of the empty bed, the soft fabric cold beneath her hands, the silence in the room now a deafening roar in her ears. How? The question screamed internally, echoing the terrifying impossibility of it all. The locked room offered no answers, only an immediate, profound mystery that felt utterly unsolvable. They stood there, frozen, two parents in the center of their daughter's empty, locked world, the first tendrils of a terrifying, enduring mystery tightening around them. What they didn't know was this was just the beginning of the impossible questions. The wail of sirens, distant at first, then shrieking close, tore through the stunned silence that had enveloped the house. Uniforms, stark and official, began to fill the doorway, their presence a cold, hard shock against the soft edges of unimaginable grief. Sarah watched them move through the living room, their boots heavy on the rug, where just yesterday Michael had sprawled, sketching dragons. She saw their eyes scanning, searching. But for what? A fingerprint? A disturbed curtain? How could anything in this familiar space explain the impossible emptiness upstairs? Her hands clenched, nails digging into her palms, the raw despair a physical ache in her chest. She saw a young officer kneel by the foot of the stairs, his face etched with confusion as he looked up at the landing, then back at a more senior man who merely shook his head, a flicker of bewilderment in his eyes. They talked in hushed tones, their voices clinical against the backdrop of her ragged breathing. There was no forced entry, they confirmed. The back door secured from the inside, the window latched tight. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist within the confines of his own room, a room locked from the inside. This wasn't a break-in, it was something else, something that defied logic, and the dawning realization that even these trained professionals, symbols of order and control, looked lost, sent a fresh wave of terror through her. It was like looking into a bottomless well, the darkness offering no reflection, no answer. The helplessness wasn't just hers, it was in the air, a suffocating weight shared by every uniform, every whispered question, promising that the immediate path forward was utterly, terrifyingly dark. Weeks bled into months, each sunrise a dull echo of the one before, bringing no news, no sign. The initial surge of community support, the frantic energy of search parties combing the woods, the endless stream of volunteers, it all began to thin, then dissipate. Posters stapled to telephone poles became weathered relics, edges curling, ink bleeding in the rain, a visual testament to the slow, painful erosion of hope. In the town square, where maps and photos had once plastered every surface, only damp, peeling paper remained, smelling of mildew and forgotten promises. The hum of concerned voices was replaced by the indifferent whistle of the wind through empty streets. For the family, the house, once a chaotic hub of activity, became a tomb of silence. The phone, which had rung incessantly with tips and offers of help, now sat mute, its silence a heavier burden than any noise. Every lead, every potential sighting, dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind only the bitter taste of disappointment. The frantic energy that had propelled them through the first weeks gave way to profound exhaustion. Sleep offered little respite, haunted by fragmented dreams that twisted cherished memories into agonizing what-ifs. They moved through their days in a daze, the weight of absence pressing down on their chests. One afternoon, sunlight slanted through the living room window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, settling on untouched surfaces. The mother's gaze fell upon a small, brightly colored drawing taped to the refrigerator door, a wobbly sun and stick figures, signed with a beloved name. A wave of pure, sharp nostalgia washed over her, a sudden, intense ache for the simple, loud joy that had once filled this space. It was a moment of profound sadness, a vivid contrast to the muted despair that had become their constant companion. Tears streamed down her face, not the desperate sobs of the early days, but a quiet, steady flow that felt unending. The active search was over. The world had moved on, but their wait had just begun, transforming from frantic action into a silent, agonizing endurance. The quiet house held its secrets close, refusing to offer even the smallest whisper of comfort. Yet among the familiar things, one object seemed subtly out of place, drawing a lingering, uneasy glance. Nearly 3 decades had passed since Sarah vanished from the edge of these woods, yet the town of Oakhaven still felt her absence like a phantom limb. New businesses had sprung up along Main Street. The old cinema was now a hardware store, and the high school had a fresh coat of paint. But beneath the veneer of progress, the air remained thick with unspoken grief. For Sarah's family, time hadn't healed. It had merely layered dust over the raw wound. Emily, her younger sister, now a woman with lines etched around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights more than age, still lived in the house where Sarah's bedroom sat preserved, a silent shrine. The floral wallpaper Sarah had chosen still bloomed on the walls. The stuffed bear she'd slept with perched on the pillow. Stepping into the room was a plunge back in time, a cruel trick of memory that offered comfort only to snatch it away. Emily traced a finger over the worn cover of a shared photo album on the dresser, the faded images mocking the life that had been stolen. Her mother rarely spoke Sarah's name aloud anymore. Her father retreated into himself, a man whose laughter had died the day his eldest daughter disappeared. the unresolved pain manifested in quiet ways. Doors left unlocked, just in case. Eyes scanning crowds automatically. A flinch at the sound of a distant siren. One overcast afternoon, Emily found herself standing at the edge of the old walking path Sarah used to take. The woods ahead dense and silent. A chill wind whispered through the leaves, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay, a scent that always felt like a warning. She closed her eyes, picturing Sarah's bright smile just before she walked away. That smile was the sharpest pain of all, a beautiful, agonizing memory, suspended forever in time. The path ahead twisted into the trees, dark and uninviting, yet a strange pull urged her forward, a nagging feeling that the woods still held their secrets, waiting. 30 years had bled into the calendar since that day, each year a silent, cruel thief, stealing hope with the quiet precision of a glacier. The case file, a once urgent collection of frantic notes and promising leads, now sat on a high shelf in the cold storage room of the precinct, a thick, yellowing tomb. Detective Miller, the third investigator assigned over the decades, occasionally pulled it down, the brittle manila folder sighing as he opened it. He'd flip through the familiar pages, grainy photographs of smiling faces now frozen in time, witness statements that led nowhere, lists of theories exhausted and discarded. Dust motes danced in the beam of his desk lamp, illuminating the stagnant air around the file, a visual echo of the investigation itself. Nothing ever changed. No new fingerprints, no surprise witnesses, no deathbed confessions. Just the same unsolvable riddle staring back, mocking the passage of time. For Sarah, 30 years wasn't just a number. It was a perpetual ache behind her ribs, a hollow space where her sister's laughter used to be. She visited the small memorial every year, the chipped stone cold beneath her fingertips, the air thick with unspoken questions. Why? How? Where are you? The world outside kept spinning. Children grew up, seasons changed, new headlines dominated the news. But for Sarah and the other families, life remained suspended in that terrifying unknown. The injustice of it gnawed at her soul. Their loved ones were just a forgotten file, a cold statistic, while their absence remained a burning, open wound. She would sit in her quiet living room, the silence amplifying the echoes of memory, clutching a worn photograph. Her sister's eyes, so full of life then, seemed to hold a secret she could never decipher. But lately, a strange, persistent feeling had settled over Sarah, a faint tremor beneath the surface of her despair, as if the frozen current of the past was finally beginning to thaw. A single, unexpected call had arrived just yesterday, pulling the file and her heart back into the light. Dust motes danced in thick, golden shafts of light, filtering through the high, grimy window of the forgotten storage room. The air hung still and heavy, carrying the faint, dry scent of decay and things long untouched. He knelt beside a stack of forgotten boxes, their cardboard softened and warped with age, layers of dust clinging to the surfaces like a second skin. His breath stirred the particles, making the air shimmer around his face. It was a chore, this clearing, a necessary task to make space, but his movements were slow, methodical, born of years of searching through the detritus of the past, always hoping, always finding nothing of real significance. He lifted the lid of one box, the dry cardboard scratching against the floor, and peered inside. Mostly old clothes, smelling faintly of mothballs and long-gone summers. He sifted through them, the fabrics rough and unfamiliar against his fingertips, pushing aside, faded dresses, and stiffened collars. Beneath the clothing lay a layer of papers, old letters tied with brittle ribbon, yellowed photographs of faces he barely recognized, school reports. Then, his fingers brushed against something different. Not paper thin, but solid, bound. He froze, his hand hovering above it for a moment. Curiosity warred with a sudden, sharp apprehension. His heart began to pound against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the suffocating quiet. Carefully, almost reverently, he pulled it out. It was a small, worn book, covered in faded blue fabric, tied with a thin, tattered ribbon. Dust puffed from it as he lifted it, catching in the light beams. His thumb traced the raised pattern on the cover, a familiar, almost forgotten design. A wave of dizziness washed over him. Could it be? After all these years, after every dead end, every crushing disappointment, tucked away in this forgotten corner? His hands trembled slightly as he brushed away the thickest layer of dust, revealing the faded, handwritten name on the cover. Sarah. A sharp intake of breath was the only sound, the air suddenly thin and cold. It was Sarah's diary. The sheer improbability of it, here, now, struck him with the force of a physical blow. Apprehension about what secrets it might hold, tangled violently with a sudden, fragile, almost terrifying surge of renewed hope. Could the answers finally lie within these brittle pages? The small book felt impossibly heavy in their hand, not just from its aged materials, but from the sheer weight of time and unspoken history it contained. Its cover, once perhaps a bright, hopeful color, was now faded to a muted, indeterminate brown, scarred with scuffs and faint water stains like old bruises. The binding creaked protestingly as they gently turned it over, the threadbare spine threatening to give way entirely. A faint, earthy smell, mingled with the dry scent of old paper and something else, something vaguely floral and long gone, rose from it. It felt fragile, brittle, like touching something that should have turned to dust years ago. Their fingers traced the intricate looping inscription etched into the upper corner of the cover. Not a name, but a tiny, familiar symbol, a stylized star they had seen doodled in countless margins of shared textbooks long ago. Recognition hit like a physical blow, stealing the air from their lungs. Sarah. This wasn't just a diary, it was Sarah's. A tremor ran through their arm, the book rattling slightly in their grip. This wasn't just an object. It was a direct line to a life brutally interrupted, a voice silenced before its time. A rush of images, fragmented and painful, flickered behind their eyes. Sarah's laugh, the way she chewed on her lip when she was thinking, the secrets they had shared, whispered under starlit skies. Holding this felt profoundly personal, an intimate trespass on grief. Should they even be touching it? What right did they have to pry open the final, private thoughts of someone lost? The ethics of it warred fiercely with a desperate, gnawing need for answers, for understanding. What if it held the key? What if it explained everything? But what if it held horrors, fears Sarah never spoke aloud, things too painful to bear? The thought of uncovering her last moments through her own words sent a chill down their spine, a cold dread mingling with the white-hot heat of anticipation. Every nerve ending felt alive, vibrating with the tension between reverence for the dead and the urgent pull of the truth. The small, faded book seemed to pulse with silent secrets, daring them to unlock them. Their gaze fixed on the brittle edges of the closed pages, each one a potential revelation, each one a step closer to a past best left buried, yet impossible to ignore. The silence in the air seemed to deepen, waiting with bated breath. The worn cover creaked open, revealing pages filled with a girl's looping script, dated years before the silence fell. His fingers traced the lines, pulling back the veil on a young woman's life, vibrant and ordinary before it became a mystery. Sarah's early entries painted a picture of sun-drenched afternoons and whispered secrets. She wrote of her best friend, Emily, their shared dreams of leaving their small town, chasing futures that felt impossibly large and bright. She described the awkward encounters with a boy named Mark, the fluttery anticipation of Friday night lights, the small anxieties of homework and fitting in. Her personality bloomed on the page, a mix of shy hope and surprising determination, a fierce loyalty to those she cared about, and a deep, quiet longing for something more. He saw the small details, the way the light hit the classroom window just right, the smell of cut grass after a rain, the rhythm of her walk home from school. It wasn't a list of events, it was the texture of her everyday. A particular entry, detailing a simple walk through the woods, describing the shade beneath the old oaks and the feel of pine needles underfoot, resonated with a painful clarity, a stark contrast to the grim location where her story seemed to end. A surge of fierce empathy washed over him. He felt her breath in the words, saw the world through her teenage eyes for a fleeting, aching moment. He learned she loved to draw, her sketches sometimes filling the margins, simple flowers or abstract shapes filled with youthful energy. She mentioned planning a camping trip with Emily and a few others, a tentative date circled faintly on a later page. The lightness of these early hopes, the innocent depiction of her world, tightened something cold and heavy in his chest. This wasn't a distant victim. This was Sarah, a girl who worried about her algebra test and wondered if Mark would ever notice her. A girl whose voice now echoed from these fragile pages, hinting at paths taken before everything went dark. What could possibly have changed her world so completely? The yellowed pages grew thinner, brittle like autumn leaves, as the reader's fingers traced the final weeks of 1987. The familiar scrawl began to show signs of strain, the loops tighter, the lines sometimes wavering across the blue rule. A knot tightened in the pit of the stomach. The date 1988 loomed, a chilling marker known from newspaper headlines and faded police flyers. Entries shifted subtly. The usual teenage laments about homework or crushes gave way to brief, clipped sentences. "Heard footsteps outside my window tonight," one noted, ink smudged slightly as if the pen had hesitated. "Felt watched." Simple words that now, in the grim light of hindsight, screamed danger. A palpable tension began to leak from the pages, infusing the quiet room with the phantom dread of the girl who held the pen over 3 decades ago. Was it just youthful, overactive imagination? Or was a real shadow falling across her path? The reader leaned closer, breath held, straining to catch every nuance, every hidden warning in the hurried script. She wrote about restless nights, about a recurring dream she couldn't quite remember, but left her heart pounding. A brief, hopeful entry about seeing someone she liked, a fleeting moment of normalcy, felt tragically out of place against the growing tide of unease. She mentioned packing a small bag, not for a trip, but just in case, a detail that sent a shiver down the reader's spine. The air felt heavy, charged with the unspoken fears recorded in the dead of winter, 1988 drawing nearer with every turned page. There was a frantic energy to these last entries, a sense of someone running out of time, documenting whispers she couldn't understand or name, but which she felt closing in. The ink seemed to grow fainter on the final dated page before the abrupt silence. The brittle page crackled under her careful touch, the last entry from the diary's original author, dated simply, starkly, October 25th, 1988. It wasn't a dramatic farewell or a desperate plea etched into the paper. Instead, the words, slightly smudged, as if written in haste or perhaps through tears, chronicled something disturbingly ordinary. A description of the crisp autumn air outside the bus window, the way the leaves were turning a final, vibrant red before falling, the mundane chatter of friends in the seats around them. There was a line about a knot tightening in her stomach, dismissed quickly as eating too much pie at lunch, followed by a vague reference to a shared look with someone across the aisle, a look she couldn't quite decipher. Then, just 3 small dots, an ellipsis trailing off into nothingness. That was it. The pen stroke ended abruptly, the ink bleeding slightly on the porous paper, as if the writer had been suddenly interrupted or pulled away mid-thought. A chill traced its way down Sarah's spine, colder than the air in the isolated cabin. This wasn't a conclusion. It was a sudden, violent stop. Flipping the page felt like stepping off a cliff. Blank, untouched pages stared back at her, a stark white silence following the faint, faded script. The familiar rhythm of the diary's entries, the slow unfolding of daily life and teenage secrets, crashed against this final, mundane, terrifyingly unfinished sentence. Hope, a fragile butterfly that had stirred in her chest with each turned page, fluttered erratically and then seemed to die. The diary, this intimate window into the past, had reached its historical endpoint, confirming the terrible finality of that day in 1988. It offered no explanation, no cryptic clue, just the chilling banality of a normal afternoon abruptly severed. This paper trail ended here, a historical dead end confirming the moment the known world went silent. But if the diary couldn't explain what happened after this final entry, then the answers had to lie elsewhere, perhaps where the bus itself had finally come to rest. They reached what should have been the end. The final page of the worn journal, marked by faded ink recounting the last known entry from decades past. A heavy silence hung in the air, weighted by the tragedy chronicled within the brittle pages. A profound sense of finality settled over them. They had reached the end of the story, the last whispers of those lost years ago. But as their fingers, trembling from the emotional weight of the journey through the past, gently turned the purportedly final leaf, their breath hitched. It wasn't the back cover. A new page stared back, starkly different from the parchment preceding it. The paper felt smoother, less aged under their touch. The ink was a vibrant black, startlingly crisp against the pale surface, not faded or bleeding into the fibers like the earlier entries. And then they saw the date, scrawled across the top corner in that same impossibly fresh ink. Yesterday. Disbelief slammed into them, a physical blow that stole the air from their lungs. Yesterday? How could a journal silent for over 20 years suddenly have an entry dated yesterday? Their mind reeled, grasping for logical explanations. A misplaced page, a cruel prank, a mistake in the light. But the date was clear, undeniable. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the confusion. Who wrote this? How did it get here? Had someone been watching them? Was the past not buried but somehow alive? Their eyes darted across the page, searching for answers, finding only a short, chilling passage penned in that unnerving script. It wasn't a narrative, not like the other entries. It was a statement, cryptic and unsettling, a few stark lines that seemed to mock everything they had just learned, ending with a sentence that felt less like a note to oneself and more like a direct address, a chilling acknowledgement of their intrusion into the past. The words themselves were simple, yet their implication given the date, twisted their gut into knots. The blood drained from their face. The journal wasn't just a relic. It was a living, breathing, terrifying thread connecting the distant horror to now. The quiet room seemed to press in, the shadows deepening as the impossible truth settled. The story wasn't over. The crisp digital image shimmered on the screen. An impossible photograph, a page from a life they had buried 22 years ago. It showed Sarah, older, her face thinner but unmistakably hers, scribbling in a worn notebook. The room, once filled with the hushed grief that had become their air, now crackled with a volatile mixture of disbelief and frantic, terrifying hope. Sarah's mother reached out a trembling hand, her fingers hovering inches from the glowing glass, as if she could touch the impossible image, feel the warmth of her daughter's skin. A choked sob escaped her lips, sharp as broken glass. Her husband pulled her close, his own face etched with a raw, desperate question mark. Is it real?" he whispered, the words catching in his throat. Sarah's brother, Mark, leaned in, his eyes scanning every pixel, every shadow, searching for a flaw, a sign of manipulation. He felt a cold dread coil in his gut, a trick, a cruel hoax, but his heart hammered against his ribs, daring to believe. Could she be alive? All this time? They spent hours in a blur of frantic activity. Calls were made, quiet and urgent. A trusted old friend, a retired sheriff's deputy, arrived, his expression shifting from cautious sympathy to stunned silence as he saw the image. He examined the metadata Mark had pulled, his brow furrowed, mumbling about potential origins. They talked to a tech expert Mark knew, the sterile language of digital forensics clashing brutally with the primal ache in their chests. Each failed attempt to definitively debunk it only amplified the terror. If it wasn't a fake, what did it mean? Was it recent? Was she a prisoner? Was this a message, a cry for help, etched into the digital ether? The air grew thick with unspoken fears, the scent of stale coffee and fear clinging to everything. Mark stared at his sister's face on the screen, seeing not just the ghost of a past life, but the terrifying possibility of a present one he couldn't comprehend. The knot in his stomach tightened as he noticed a faint, almost imperceptible symbol etched onto the corner of the notebook in the photo. Something unsettlingly familiar from the older evidence. The rough paper crackled under their trembling fingers as they smoothed out the single recent entry. It was starkly different from the faded ink and formal hand of the older journals scattered around them, written in a frantic, jagged script that looked etched rather than written, as if with a sharp stone dipped in something dark. The air in the room felt suddenly colder, thicker with a palpable dread that wasn't just from the damp stone walls, but from the words themselves. They leaned closer, eyes scanning for anything familiar, any thread connecting this raw, modern fear to the ghosts of the past they'd been uncovering. Names, places, dates. Their mind raced, cross-referencing against fragments gleaned from decades-old entries, searching for echoes in the frantic scrawl. A chilling symbol, one they'd seen hinted at in a forgotten sketch in an earlier ledger, appeared scrawled next to a date, only a few weeks prior. It sent a jolt of ice through their veins. Why here? Why now? What had driven someone, likely terrified, to add their own panicked note to this morbid archive? Was it a confession, a warning, or worse, an attempt to continue whatever sinister pattern had begun so long ago? Every frantic line felt loaded with unspoken terror, a desperate cry trapped on paper. They pictured the writer, hunched in secret, quill scratching against the rough surface, heart pounding like a trapped bird. What did they see? What did they know? The weight of the present horror pressed down, connecting seamlessly with the historical one. This wasn't just history anymore. It was a living, breathing threat. A single word, repeated multiple times, stood out. Cycle. It was a word never used in the older entries, yet it resonated with the grim sense of repetition they had begun to feel. The emotional climax hit hard. This wasn't just about what happened, but why it seemed destined to happen again. The faint scent of something metallic, like old pennies, seemed to rise from the page. As their fingers traced the word cycle, they felt a sudden certainty, a dreadful pull towards something hidden nearby. Section 15. A 30-year trail reignited. Detective Miller's fingers trembled as he held the brittle page. 30 years. 30 years of a cold case, a ghost story whispered to the small town. The file gathering dust, hope long extinguished. This changes everything. The ink, though faded, was legible, scrawled in a hand he dimly recognized from fragments of other notes in the original case file. A name, a date, a location that wasn't in any of the police reports or witness statements from 1993. The air in the precinct, usually thick with the stale smell of coffee and desperation, felt suddenly charged, alive with a dangerous energy. He hunched over the page at his desk, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, casting a harsh glow on the worn wood and scattered files. His gaze darted between the new entry and a laminated map tacked to the corkboard, the location marking a spot miles away from where everyone assumed the trail went cold. It wasn't just a random note. It felt deliberate, a hidden breadcrumb left for someone, somehow, to find. A sharp pang of regret twisted in his gut. How had they missed this? Had it been hidden all along? Or was it truly a new discovery? He remembered the suffocating helplessness of those first few weeks, the frantic searches yielding nothing but damp earth and the crushing weight of silence. We looked everywhere. Now, fueled by a desperate, fragile hope, he worked tirelessly, comparing the new information against old records, cross-referencing names, dates, and cryptic phrases. The faded words on the page seemed to whisper secrets, pulling him back into the past while anchoring him firmly in the sterile, digital present. He opened archived emails, ran database searches, the click-clack of the keyboard a sharp counterpoint to the quiet tension that now filled the office. A name from the page pinged against a local address from 30 years ago, an address that hadn't been listed among the known associates. He felt a jolt, a physical response to the connection forming. The path was muddy, obscured by time and false assumptions, but the new page was a compass needle, stubbornly pointing in a direction they had never considered. He reached for his coat, the worn fabric familiar against his skin. This name, this location, it was the first solid lead in 3 decades. He needed to see it, feel the ground beneath his feet, bridge the 30-year gap between the faded ink and the present reality. Stepping out into the damp evening air, the city lights blurred by a thin mist, he knew this journey back into the past was just beginning. The air in the dusty attic hung thick and still, trapping the scent of decay and forgotten things. Sunlight sliced through a grimy window pane, illuminating the frantic beat of his own pulse against his ribs. She stood across from him, the worn leather diary clutched tight, its fragile pages brittle with time. He watched her eyes, wide with dawning horror, flicker between the faded ink of the last entry and his face. "It was you," she whispered, the accusation hanging in the silence like a physical weight. A unique, terrible nostalgia washed over him, the phantom scent of Sarah's cheap strawberry lip balm, the nervous flutter in his stomach as he waited for her that afternoon decades ago by the old creek bed. He remembered the panic when she saw what he was hiding, the clumsy, desperate act that followed, the earth accepting her like a hungry mouth. He saw it all flash behind her eyes now, pulled from the shadows by that single damning sentence Sarah had scribbled just before she left. The revelation ripped through the quiet room, a soundless scream that echoed the one trapped inside him for 35 years. Mr. Abernathy, the quiet man from the Historical Society, the keeper of town secrets, sagged against a stack of old furniture, the composure he wore like a cloak dissolving into dust. His hands trembled, reaching instinctively for the diary page she held, then pulling back as if burned. She saw, he choked out, the words rasping like gravel. I didn't mean. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. His motive, simple and horrifying, spilled out in a torrent of regret and self-pity, a youthful mistake Sarah had witnessed, something that would have ruined him, maybe even his family. The recent diary entry wasn't new. It was the final, unearthed page from Sarah's original journal, found hidden where he'd thought no one would ever look, a silent witness resurrected by chance. Justice arrived not with a bang, but with the distant wail of a siren growing steadily louder, filling the space where his confession left a gaping void. The attic door burst open, flooding the scene with the harsh light of reality and the serious faces of the sheriff's deputies. He offered no resistance, his shoulders slumped in defeat, the weight of decades lifting and crushing him all at once. He was led away, a specter from the past finally tangible, leaving behind a stillness that felt profound and heavy. She stood there, the diary still in her hands, the silence of the attic now vast and empty, filled only with the echoes of a life taken and a truth finally told. The sunbeam shifted, leaving the corner where he stood moments before in shadow, plunging the space into a new, unsettling darkness. What did you do now, when the monster was gone, but the scars remained? Warning: this story contains disturbing details and may not be suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is advised. For 22 years, the disappearance of a high school class trip in rural Oregon has been a ghost story whispered in hushed tones across the state. Everyone in the nearby town of Havenwood assumed it was a tragic accident, a bus lost to a sudden landslide on the treacherous mountain pass. Search parties found nothing but torn earth and twisted trees. They're gone, the sheriff had told the distraught parents, his voice heavy with finality. Just gone. But that wasn't the truth. Not the whole truth. Until a hiker, far off the marked trails, stumbled upon a rusted school bus deep in the woods, not crushed by earth, but strangely preserved, eerily silent. The discovery tore open old wounds, revealing evidence that proved this wasn't an accident. It was a ritual. If you see someone being disrespected like this, like and tell us in the comments what you would do. The gavel struck, a sharp, final sound echoing in the quiet courtroom, sealing the fate of those who had stolen Sarah and the others. Outside, the air felt thin and cold despite the mild afternoon sun. Sarah's mother, Eleanor, gripped her husband Tom's hand, her knuckles white. Justice, or what the system called it, had been delivered, yet it felt like a hollow echo in the vast emptiness left by her daughter. They drove home in silence, the familiar route now a landscape marked by invisible scars. Walking through Sarah's room, untouched all these years, was both a comfort and a fresh agony. Her diary lay on the nightstand, the worn leather cover cool beneath Eleanor's trembling fingers. She opened it to the last entry. The truth of that night now burned into her mind, juxtaposed with Sarah's innocent hopes for the next day. A tear traced a path down Eleanor's cheek, landing on Sarah's looping script. It was here, in these pages filled with secrets and dreams, that they truly began to find a form of closure. Not peace, not forgiveness. Those felt impossibly far away, but understanding. The raw, gaping wound of uncertainty had been closed, replaced by the deep and aching sorrow of knowing. They saw Sarah's resilience in her own words, her courage in facing her fear in those final moments. Her diary wasn't just a record of a terrible crime. It was the enduring voice of their vibrant, witty girl, a testament to a life brutally cut short, but not erased. The ache in Eleanor's chest intensified, a physical manifestation of grief and love intertwined. They had honored her, found her, spoken her truth. Now, they just had to learn how to live with the quiet hum of loss, the whispers of her life echoing in the rooms, guiding them towards an unknown future. The house was quiet again. The echoes of the past had subsided, replaced by the mundane sounds of everyday life. The ticking clock in the hallway, the distant hum of traffic, the gentle sigh of the wind outside. Eleanor sat by the window, a cup of tea cooling in her hands. The intense emotions of the investigation and trial had receded, leaving behind a persistent, low-level ache. It wasn't the sharp, unbearable pain of the early years, nor the frantic despair of uncertainty, but a dull, heavy sadness that settled deep in her bones. Tom sat across the room, reading the newspaper, his face etched with a similar quiet sorrow. They didn't talk much about it anymore, not with the same urgency. The truth was known, the perpetrators locked away. Justice had been served, imperfectly as it always was, but served nonetheless. Their grief was no longer a storm, but a persistent gray cloud hanging over the landscape of their lives. It was distributed across small moments, a song on the radio, a familiar scent, the sight of children laughing in a park. There were no grand revelations or sudden epiphanies of peace, just the slow, arduous process of carrying the weight. Yet, as Eleanor watched a shaft of sunlight slant through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a faint sense of warmth touched her face. It was a small thing, a simple phenomenon of light and dust, but in its quiet persistence, it felt like a tiny, hesitant promise. Life, however changed, however diminished, found a way to continue, one quiet, ordinary moment at a time.